coming to Stimson this morning to spend a little time with us on this little bit of an unusual topic, Eurasia strategy, American and Japanese perspectives. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tatsumi. I'm a director of the Japan program and a senior associate at Stimson. For the last couple of years, Canon Institute for Global Studies based in Tokyo and Stimson have begun the collaboration where we will co-host public event once or twice a year to shoot for a rather unusual pattern of U.S.-Japan. Kuni and I like to go unconventional, so we don't want the U.S.-Japan conversation to focus just on bilateral issues or bases or U.S.-Japan security cooperation or Japanese politics. Because our two leaders describes U.S.-Japan relationship as more of a global partnership, we believe that it is really important that the conversation goes beyond the bilateral U.S.-Japan scheme and touches on the broader issues. And actually, it also gives me a great excuse to introduce to you a wonderful colleague that I have here at Stimson as well. So I greatly appreciate the opportunity that the CIGS given us to do this. So today, like I said in the beginning, you will hear a little bit of a different tone of discussion. In the last 12 months or so, the concept of Eurasia has kind of come to the very forefront of the defense strategy discussion, and in terms of how Americans look at the world. And when you look at the maritime space, the way to describe the maritime space have also evolved from, we used to call it Asia Pacific, Indian Ocean, Gulf of Arabia, and then now it's more connected. It's Indo-Pacific and Gulf of Eden, or much larger. And Eurasia is kind of a competing a theoretical perspective to look at it on the landmass side of things that covers the vast area from Europe to East Asia. So how does and should we, as in the United States, should look at this broader region, and how Japanese look at this emerging strategic concept? This is what we're going to have a conversation on the next 90 minutes or so. Let me quickly introduce the wonderful set of speakers that I'm fortunate to have this morning. Immediately to my left is my wonderful colleague, Samir Lawani. He's a senior associate and deputy director for South Asia program at Stimson. And he was before coming to Stimson, he spent a little bit of time at RAND Corporation. He was also a national security next generation leaders fellow at the Center for New American Security, and also participant in the CSIS Nuclear Scholar Initiative. To his left is my former boss, Laipson, distinguished fellow, and the president emeritus of the Stimson. Her core expertise in the Middle East space, but she has touched a broader issue of national security and intelligence. Her last job that she had in public service was the deputy chairman of the National Intelligence Council, the position she served between 1997 through 2002. Even after she left the government, she did served on a couple of the government's advisory panel, including President Obama's Intelligence Advisory Board and Secretary of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. To her left is Kuni Miyake. I will call him my boss in Tokyo. He's a research director at the Canon Institute of Global Studies in charge of foreign affairs and national security issues. Prior to that, he's a retired diplomat. Also, his core strength started out as a Middle East, but since then he played the really essential role in the first round of the U.S.-Japan guideline revision as a director of the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty Division. That's where I first met him about 20 years ago. That reveals both of our age, so I will not further discuss that. But since then, he also has served in China as a Minister of Public Affairs. So he has had the wide range of position that allowed him to look at Middle East and the Asia at large. And to the far right, and not to the least, is Jimbo. He's a senior fellow at the CIGS, but that's a dual hat position. He spends most of his time at the Keio University as associate professor. He is one of Japan's leading expert on the Asia-Pacific security issues, that if something bad happens to him, Japan's intellectual property in that realm will be diminished by 50% probably. So we all pray for his long life, long and healthy life. And without further ado, I'll just dive into the discussion. So what's going to happen is that I will pose the short question to each four participants. So we go round. We do that round about 2 or 3 times, depending on how the conversation flows amongst you all. And then toward the end, I will definitely open up the floor to the questions. So starting out, Eurasia covers a huge landmass, and we were just talking about how it comes back into vogue, as Ellen pointed out. And why should Americans care about this concept now as the strategic notion? I'll have you start, Ellen.
Well, thanks, Yuki, and it's a pleasure to be back with Kuni. When we were both in government, we had plenty of occasions to try to work together on U.S.-Japan cooperation in the Middle East. But I really love the broad topic that you've picked, Yuki, because I think it's important to step back from day-to-day policy issues sometimes and try to understand a little more conceptually how is the world changing. So I want to start with a little bit of a paradoxical thought, which is that, of course, geography matters. Geography matters more than ever in terms of how states and societies compete over natural resources and who's friendly and who's not friendly in neighborhoods around the globe. And the Eurasian landmass has always been a geographic truth that, and it happens in Russia, that Russia is both in Europe and in Asia. Turkey has the same identity issue, which is that it literally is the bridge where the landmass of Europe and landmass of Asia begin. So it's an enduring reality that there's a place called Eurasia. As a practical matter, it's not been an organizing principle for the United States in recent years, but it's a very good question of should it come back into vogue and be a useful concept for us. So, geography matters, and then geography matters less in the age of globalization, okay? That we can find coalitions and alliances and partnerships that jump over geographic space as governments try to find opportunities to cooperate with like-minded countries. So I guess I want to start with that the Eurasian landmass maybe is almost too big to imagine it as a single zone of peace and security and cooperation. There's too much competition inside it, and that it's going to be a very natural phenomenon to break it into smaller pieces. But I think it's very useful to push us a bit as we think of the rise of Asia to make the connection between our enduring interests in Europe and our greater cultural familiarity and comfort in working transatlantic. How do we connect that to the rise of Asia and to America's engagement in Asia? So are there ways to make more real and bring together when we think of problem solving, is there a way that you have the U.S., Europe, and Asia in the same room together? We have tended to segment it and say either it's transatlantic cooperation or it's our grand strategy towards Asia, and we know who the great Asian powers are, and Japan looms very large in that formulation. But should we, the U.S., and then let's take the U.S. out of the equation. Is it happening spontaneously between Europeans and Asians to engage more directly, whether the U.S. is the prime mover or not? So I think it's an intriguing question. I think that for policymakers, big bureaucracies break things into pieces, and the pieces are never perfect. So however you define the regions of the world, there's always going to be some problem that you're missing. So when the U.S. government created the South Asia Bureau, it was considered a small and weak bureau compared to the larger bureau, so they added Central Asia to it. Well, Central Asia could just as logically have stayed connected to the bureau that covered Russia or the bureau that covered East Asia. So I guess a simple answer, if I just think in a very inside the beltway fashion, I don't think the U.S. system will embrace Eurasia as an organizing principle for the bureaucracy, but I think it's a broader concept that we need to keep in mind when we want to think about how to promote international cooperation and, in some cases, how to reduce the burden on the United States to be the organizer of international responses to big problems.
And Samir, your core expertise in South Asia, but then you often talk a lot about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and how U.S. should actually think through these issues and also look at the Eurasia as the one strategic zone as we look at how we operate within there, particularly in the political military realm. So let me pose the same question to you and
Sure.
Get your thought.
Yeah, so I was brushing off my my old notes on grand strategy from years and years ago as I was trying to understand this concept. And, Eurasia as a concept features very large in sort of debates on grand strategy. The United States has long been concerned about Eurasia, even if we don't sort of specify it in those terms, at least in the bureaucratic realm. But a lot of IR theorists would say that the United States has cared a great deal about Eurasia since the beginning of the Cold War, and the objective, and even prior to that, in World War II and prior to that, the objective was to prevent dominance of a single hegemon on sort of the more industrialized portions of Eurasia. So the objectives in World War II were to prevent sort of Germany's hegemonic rise and dominance of Europe, but also Eurasia, right, because there was a pivot towards the West as well. The challenge to the Soviet Union was also based on sort of preventing this dominance of a single hegemon. And even though the United States economy was pretty independent to a degree, and its security has always been sort of guaranteed just by sort of our natural geography, there was a concern always that the event of a great power war and a hegemon in industrial Eurasia would pose a threat to either U.S. economic interests, both sort of directly and indirectly because of the consequence of a great power war. Modern weaponry in this day and age can have tremendous destructive power, and with greater integrated economic sort of engagements, that would come back to affect us, at least economically, if not militarily. So I think at the very high level, this has always been a concern for the United States, and I think it sort of shapes how we think about what our core equities are and what regions, even within Eurasia, matter most to us. So another question I think Yuki had posed earlier that we were talking about was, what are the regions within Eurasia that we care a great deal about? Well, industrial Europe was always sort of central to this. Industrial Northeast Asia was always central to this. And the Middle East, historically, even prior to the sort of the stand-up of CENTCOM, was always very important because of energy resources. As militaries and economies transitioned to be dependent on an oil economy and hydrocarbon economy, this became central for U.S. security interests. So these were sort of the core of it. But gradually, as we've seen global supply chains sort of spread out beyond those sort of three epicenters of industrial or sort of, the core economy of the United States, we've seen this sort of move into Southeast Asia, where there's a lot more sort of industry there, and global supply chains depend on Southeast Asia and South Asia as well, and Eastern Europe. So I think it's much broader in some ways. So a lot of places are critical, but there are different ways to ensure the security or stability of those areas. And I think oftentimes we tend to conflate ensuring stability and security with having to have a forward presence in all these places, and that may not necessarily be essential to have a Eurasia strategy. You asked about South Asia and its configuration within this, and sort of what are the challenges here with equities in Afghanistan and Pakistan and India. I think we're starting to see a lot of U.S. policymakers, but also policymakers within South Asia and East Asia, start to think about this relationship of the Indo-Pacific, so that the South Asia is deeply intertwined with Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, both economically, but also it's going to be strategically maritime sort of traffic that moves through the South China Sea, then enters into the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean is sort of like one of the central They're places for a lot of maritime traffic, for a lot of hydrocarbon traffic. So they're interconnected economically, and then they're becoming interconnected because of that geopolitically in terms of great power competition within Eurasia. So India is a central part of U.S. strategy to create geopolitical pluralism in Eurasia, to balance maybe China and maybe some other rising or re-emerging powers. So it becomes sort of part of U.S. strategy. But at the same time, there are other sort of things that we're doing in the region that tend to sort of draw both attention, resources, and bureaucratic focus. So we also have close to 10,000 troops deployed in the middle of Central Asia, in Afghanistan. And that can, you can say at times that might be congruent with certain parts of Eurasian strategy. It could be in tension, though, in some ways. And I think one area where you're starting to see sort of this tension is, as Ellen pointed out, the bureaucracy is unable to sort of focus around sort of a larger unifying principle of the Indo-Pacific or Eurasia, in part because there are certain bureaucratic sort of departments within the State Department, the SRAP's office, or a section within OSD policy that has to focus specifically on this Afghanistan-Pakistan problem because of forces deployed in the region. And so that then maybe limits their ability to sort of engage with the broader sort of regional conceptualization of South Asia and the interconnectedness and spillover effects of policy decisions, and then in turn sort of building that strategy in tandem with U.S. strategy in East Asia as well.
Thank you. Kuni, why should Japan care about Eurasia?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank Stimson Center for making this happen, because I never wanted to do anything by the Japan-U.S. people, for the Japan-U.S. people. There are so many occasions like that, but I just want to be more global. So I do not represent any government in this place. I always want to share with you some of my thoughts about my sort of Kuni Miyake School of Global Geopolitical Studies. I see, and I know how important concept of Eurasia for Japan. Well, those days are gone when Japan just think about East Asia and just think about U.S.-Japan security alliance. Those days are gone, I think. And when I see the Eurasian continent, it's my thinking. I see three theaters, basically. European theater, Middle Eastern theater, and East Asia. And I see revisionist powers over there. I see one in Russia. I see another in Iran. Maybe you may disagree. And then I see China in East Asia. Unfortunately, those theaters are not mutually independent anymore. I mean, given the speed and volume, the quality of the movement of goods and services and information that really connect those theaters together. So I like to share with you what I have in mind for the policy Japan should have vis-a-vis the Eurasian continent. First of all, basically what we need to do is to prevent any hegemonic power dominating in each of those theaters. Second, prevent also at the same time the cooperation among those revisionist powers and dominating on the Eurasian continent. It is pretty simple to say that the Middle East is so important to us because it is the main source of energy for Japan. And of course, that